I've built a lot in my life, a successful company, a beautiful home, and a family I loved more than anything, but there's one thing I never built, and that is tolerance. Tolerance for a man who walks into my house, drinks my expensive whiskey, sits in my chair, and laughs like everything I spent 40 years building already belongs to him. What if I told you that one ordinary September afternoon I pulled up to my own cabin and found my in-laws had already moved in? They were eating my food, drinking my bourbon, laughing in my living room, and talking about my property like it was their future inheritance. What would you do if the people who were supposed to respect you the most started treating your life's work like a free vacation home? Stick with me till the end, because what I did next wasn't loud shouting or drama. It was quiet, cold, calculated, and it hurt them far more than any argument ever could. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. If you're new here, smash that like button right now and subscribe, drop a comment, and tell me, have your in-laws ever crossed a serious line with you? My name is Richard Harlan. I'm 68 years old, born and raised in Boise, Idaho. After decades of hard work, I built a construction company that employed over 40 people, a comfortable home, and most importantly, one son, Jacob, who is 32 now, smart, kind-hearted, and the best thing I ever contributed to this world. 12 years ago, I bought a stunning 4-bedroom lake cabin on the outskirts of McCall, Idaho. It sat right on the water with a huge wooden deck overlooking the lake, tall pine trees all around, and air so fresh it felt like it cleaned your soul. I had planned to rent it out as the McCall market was booming, and my property manager, Linda, had already received several strong applications. All I needed was one final walkthrough. It was a perfect September afternoon with golden sunlight and cool breeze when I made the 2-hour drive with windows down, feeling peaceful. But the moment I turned onto that private road, something felt wrong. 3 unfamiliar vehicles were parked carelessly in my driveway: a black Ford F-150 with Kansas plates, a white SUV, and a small sedan. My garage door was wide open and comfortable music was playing inside. I walked through my own front door and the sight hit me hard. 6 people were inside, acting like they owned the place. Victor Lang, my daughter-in-law Cassie's father, was leaned back in my favorite leather recliner, looking completely at home. His wife Denise was sprawled on my couch with shoes off. Their son Kyle and his girlfriend were laughing, and 2 strangers were at the kitchen island while my precious Knob Creek 2001 single-barrel bourbon bottle that I had saved for over 3 years was more than half empty. Victor saw me and gave a big arrogant smile, saying, "Richard, we were wondering when you'd show up, buddy." I stood there silently looking at the bare feet on my floors, the open bourbon, and the complete lack of respect. Then I spoke in a calm but ice-cold voice that this is my house, my name is on the deed, and every single one of you needs to be gone before I return. Victor chuckled and said Cassie told them it was fine because it would be in the family anyway. That entitled laugh burned into my memory. I looked him dead in the eyes and said only 4 words: "Replace the bourbon." Then I turned around, walked out, and closed the door without slamming it because real power doesn't need noise. I drove away, parked at a lakeside cafe, called my son Jacob and asked if he had given Cassie a key. The long silence told me everything. When I explained what I saw, he was shocked, angry, and embarrassed, but I told him not to worry because I would handle it my way. That same day, I called my trusted lawyer Mark Thompson and told my property manager Linda to pause all showings. 6 days later, at Sunday family dinner, Cassie casually mentioned her parents had stopped by the cabin. I smiled politely, asked how they liked the lake view, and changed the subject while she kept watching my face nervously, but I gave her nothing. Behind the scenes, the real game had already begun as my lawyer filed a formal trespass notice and sent Victor and Denise a certified warning letter. 1 month later, I made my real move and sold the cabin in a clean, fast cash deal. The money went into a specially structured trust where Jacob inherits very generously, but with one important condition, that if Cassie wants any access, she must first sign a post-nuptial agreement with her own independent lawyer. We also created a protected legacy fund for any future grandchildren that bypasses everyone else if needed. 2 weeks after the sale, I flew to Jackson Hole for a peaceful vacation and sent a simple postcard saying, "I'm taking some time to think, everything is good, see you soon." When I returned, I called a family meeting where my lawyer calmly explained all the documents. Cassie's face showed shock, then realization, and finally quiet acceptance, while Jacob read everything carefully and held her hand supportively. At the end, I stood up and said I built everything with my own 2 hands and protected it the same way, not out of hate, but out of responsibility, because real love isn't careless, and love without structure is just an open invitation for others to take advantage. The room fell silent after I finished speaking. For a few seconds, nobody moved, nobody argued, nobody interrupted. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I looked around the table. Jacob was staring down at the documents. Cassie's hands were folded tightly in her lap. Victor looked different than he had the day I found him sitting in my recliner at the cabin. The confidence was still there, but now there was something else mixed into it, uncertainty. And men like Victor hated uncertainty. They preferred assumptions. Assumptions were comfortable. Assumptions allowed them to build castles in their minds using someone else's bricks. For months he had assumed that cabin would remain in the family. He had assumed access. He had assumed entitlement. Most dangerous of all, he had assumed I would never notice. I pushed my chair back and quietly excused myself from the table. The conversation behind me remained stiff and awkward. No one knew exactly what to say, and that was fine. I wasn't looking for apologies. Apologies were cheap. Behavior was expensive. Later that night, I sat alone on my back porch with a cup of coffee. The autumn air had started to cool. The trees beyond the fence swayed gently in the darkness. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little peace. Not complete peace, just enough to breathe. But peace has a strange way of attracting storms. The next morning, my phone rang at 7:12 a.m. I glanced at the screen. Victor Lang. I let it ring, then ring again, then stop. A minute later, another call came through, then another. Then a voicemail notification appeared. I listened to it while staring out my kitchen window. Victor's voice sounded controlled, too controlled. The kind of voice people use when they're trying desperately not to sound angry. "Richard, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. Give me a call back. We need to talk." Need. Interesting word. Not want. Need. I deleted the voicemail. An hour later, another message arrived, this time from Denise, then another from Cassie. By lunchtime, my phone contained 6 missed calls and 4 messages. I answered none of them. Because silence can be a powerful thing. When people expect a fight, silence makes them uncomfortable. When people expect an argument, silence forces them to sit alone with their thoughts. And judging by the number of calls coming in, those thoughts were making somebody very nervous. 3 days later, Jacob stopped by my house after work. The moment I opened the door, I could tell something was wrong. His shoulders were tense. His jaw was tight. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded. We sat in the living room. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he finally sighed. "Cassie and her parents have been fighting all week." I remained quiet. "They think you overreacted." That didn't surprise me. People rarely view their own entitlement clearly. Jacob rubbed his forehead. "They keep saying it was just a misunderstanding." I looked at him. "A misunderstanding is borrowing a lawnmower and forgetting to return it." He gave a tired laugh. I continued. "A misunderstanding isn't moving 6 people into someone else's property." Jacob looked away, because deep down he knew I was right. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting, something that immediately erased whatever peace I had managed to recover. "Dad," he said quietly, "there might be something else you should know." Every instinct in my body sharpened. "What is it?" Jacob hesitated. The hesitation alone told me this wasn't good. Then he finally spoke. "About a month before you found them at the cabin, Victor was talking about making renovations." I frowned. "Renovations?" Jacob nodded slowly. He wasn't talking like a guest. A cold feeling settled in my chest. He was talking like an owner. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Jacob swallowed hard. He had floor plans printed out. I stared at him. What kind of floor plans? His answer made my blood run cold. The kind that included tearing out walls, expanding the deck, and converting your master bedroom into a suite for himself and Denise. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Not because I was angry, because I was shocked. The cabin wasn't simply being treated like a vacation home. Somewhere along the way, these people had convinced themselves it already belonged to them. And if that was true, then I had a feeling I still hadn't uncovered the full story. And what Jacob told me next would prove just how far their plans had actually gone. Then I had a feeling I still hadn't uncovered the full story. And what Jacob told me next would prove just how far their plans had actually gone. For a moment, he just sat there staring at the floor. I could tell he was debating whether to say it. The expression on his face reminded me of when he was a teenager and had broken the window in our garage with a baseball. He hadn't been afraid of punishment. He had been afraid of disappointing me. That same look was there now. "Dad," he finally said, "you need to understand something." I leaned forward. "What is it?" Jacob rubbed both hands across his face. "A few months ago, Cassie accidentally left her tablet open at the house." I frowned. "And?" His eyes met mine. "I saw messages." Something tightened in my chest. "What kind of messages?" Jacob hesitated again. "The kind that made me uncomfortable." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the trees against the window. The sound seemed unusually loud. I waited. Eventually, he continued. "They had a family group chat." I nodded. Nothing unusual about that. Most families had one. But the look on Jacob's face told me this wasn't ordinary. "What was in it?" He swallowed. "Pictures." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Pictures of what?" "The cabin." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Jacob stood up and paced toward the kitchen before turning back. They weren't just sharing vacation photos. His voice had become harder now. They were talking about future plans. I felt my jaw tighten. "What kind of plans?" Jacob laughed bitterly. Not because anything was funny, because he still couldn't believe it himself. "They had names for rooms." I stared at him. "What?" The master bedroom was already being called Mom and Dad's room. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him, but I hadn't. Jacob continued. "Kyle was talking about converting the downstairs area into a game room." I said nothing. He even posted furniture ideas. The room suddenly felt smaller. Every word painted a clearer picture. This wasn't a family that had simply overstayed their welcome. This was a family that had mentally moved in long before they physically showed up. Jacob sat back down. There was more. Of course there was. There always is. People rarely reveal the worst part first. I folded my arms. "Keep going." His voice dropped lower. Victor kept referring to the property as our cabin. I closed my eyes briefly, not because I was surprised anymore, because hearing it out loud somehow made it worse. Our cabin. 2 words. That's all it took. 2 words to erase 12 years of mortgage payments, maintenance costs, property taxes, repairs, insurance bills, and everything else that came with ownership. 2 words that transformed someone else's hard work into an assumed inheritance. Jacob looked genuinely sick. "I should have told you sooner." "No," I said quietly. "You should have told yourself sooner." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I looked at my son. People only get this comfortable when nobody stops them. His expression hardened. Because he knew I wasn't entirely talking about Victor. I was talking about everyone, including him. For years, small boundaries had been ignored, small assumptions had gone unchallenged, and eventually those assumptions grew into expectations. The silence between us stretched. Then Jacob said something I wasn't expecting. There was one message that bothered me more than all the others. Immediately I paid attention. "What message?" His face darkened. "The week before you found them there." He paused, then shook his head. I almost deleted it because it made me angry. My pulse slowed. Whenever people tell a story that way, the next part is never good. "What did it say?" Jacob looked directly at me. "It was from Victor." I waited. Jacob took a breath, then finally spoke. He wrote, "Once Richard slows down, everything will fall into place. We just need to be patient." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were threatening, because they revealed something far worse. A mindset, a belief. The belief that I wasn't a person. I was a waiting period, an obstacle, a timeline. Something standing between them and what they wanted. For the first time since the cabin incident, I felt genuine anger. Not the hot explosive kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that stays quiet. Jacob noticed the change immediately. "Dad." I stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the evening sun was disappearing behind the trees. Everything looked peaceful. But my thoughts weren't. Because one question kept repeating itself in my head. If they were comfortable enough to discuss my property behind my back, what else had they been discussing? And why did I suddenly feel like the cabin wasn't the only thing they had plans for? And why did I suddenly feel like the cabin wasn't the only thing they had plans for? That question stayed with me long after Jacob left that evening. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victor sitting in my recliner with that smug smile on his face. Not because of the cabin, because of what the cabin represented. People don't casually start planning renovations on property they don't own. They don't assign bedrooms. They don't discuss future upgrades. And they certainly don't talk about being patient while waiting for someone else's assets to become available. No, that kind of thinking comes from somewhere deeper, somewhere more dangerous. The next morning, I was sitting in my home office when Linda called. My property manager wasn't usually the type to sound nervous. She had worked in real estate for almost 20 years. Very little surprised her. But that morning, her voice sounded different. "Richard, do you have a minute?" Immediately, I sat up straighter. "Of course." There was a brief pause. "I found something while closing out the cabin file." A strange feeling settled in my stomach. "What did you find?" "I wasn't looking for it," she said quickly. "It was completely accidental." Now I was paying very close attention. "What is it, Linda?" Another pause. Then she sighed. "A contractor called me yesterday." I frowned. "A contractor?" "Yes." My grip tightened around the phone. "What about him?" "He wanted to know if the renovation project was still moving forward." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood her. "What renovation project?" The silence on the other end suddenly became very uncomfortable. Then Linda answered. "The renovation project for your cabin." I slowly stood from my chair. My heartbeat was beginning to accelerate. "What exactly did he say?" Linda shuffled through papers. "He said he had spoken to Victor several times." Every muscle in my body tightened. "He had measurements." I said nothing. "He had sketches." Still nothing. And apparently he was waiting for approval to start work sometime next spring. I walked toward the window. Outside, my backyard looked exactly the same as it always had. But inside my mind, pieces were moving rapidly. Victor hadn't just been talking. He had been planning, actual planning, with actual contractors, using property that didn't belong to him. "Did the contractor know Victor wasn't the owner?" I asked. "No." "Of course he didn't." Linda continued. "He seemed shocked when I explained the situation." I stared out at the trees. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. Not because Victor wanted the cabin. Lots of people wanted nice things. What bothered me was the assumption, the certainty, the belief that ownership was just a technicality that would eventually work itself out. Linda cleared her throat. "There's something else." I closed my eyes briefly. There was always something else. "What now?" "The contractor sent over the proposed plans." I turned back toward my desk. "What plans?" The answer made my stomach sink. He thought I was already involved in the project. I sat down slowly. "And?" Linda hesitated. "Richard, the plans didn't just include changes to the cabin." The room suddenly felt colder. "What do you mean?" Her voice lowered. "There were notes attached." I waited. Several notes. I could hear papers moving. Then she read one aloud. "Future retirement layout for parents." A chill ran through me. Another page shuffled. "Guest accommodations for extended family visits." Then another. "Long-term family gathering property." Every sentence sounded less like renovation notes and more like ownership plans, as if someone had already decided the future, as if someone had skipped over the part where the actual owner got a vote. I rubbed my forehead. Part of me was angry. Part of me was stunned. But another part was beginning to understand something important. The cabin incident hadn't been spontaneous. It wasn't a weekend mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It had been the visible tip of something much larger. Months of conversations, months of assumptions, months of private planning. Linda's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Richard?" "I'm here." She hesitated. "I don't think this started recently." Neither did I. In fact, I was starting to suspect it had been going on for far longer than anyone realized, and if that was true, then there was one person who might unknowingly hold the answers: Cassie. Because whether she meant to or not, she had been standing between both families for years, and for the first time I found myself wondering just how much she actually knew, or worse, how much she had helped create. That thought stayed with me for days, not because I wanted to believe it, because I didn't. I genuinely liked Cassie. For years I had treated her like family. I had attended her graduation, helped pay for part of her wedding, supported Jacob and her when they bought their first home. The idea that she might have played a role in all of this was something I desperately wanted to be wrong about. But sometimes the truth doesn't care what we want. A week later, Jacob called me. His voice sounded different, calmer, more certain. "Dad, can we meet?" We agreed to have lunch at a small restaurant near downtown Boise. When I arrived, he was already there. 2 cups of coffee sat on the table, one for him, one for me. The moment I sat down, I knew something had happened. Jacob wasn't the type to waste words. "What is it?" I asked. He looked out the window for a moment, then back at me. "I finally talked to Cassie." I remained silent. Really talked. My stomach tightened. "And?" Jacob exhaled slowly. "She admitted she knew more than she told us." For a second, I felt disappointment more than anger. Disappointment has a different weight. It sinks deeper. "What did she know?" Jacob looked exhausted. Her parents had been talking about the cabin for years. I closed my eyes. Years. Not months. Years. They kept saying it would eventually stay in the family. I nodded slowly, exactly what I suspected. "But here's the part that bothered her." Jacob leaned forward. "They weren't just talking about the cabin." My expression hardened. "What else?" "The business." For several seconds I said nothing. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. My construction company had taken 4 decades to build. Countless 14-hour workdays, economic downturns, missed holidays, personal sacrifices nobody ever saw, and somehow these people had been discussing it like a future hand-me-down. Jacob shook his head. Victor kept saying that eventually everything would come through the family. The arrogance of that statement almost impressed me. Almost. "What did Cassie say?" Jacob looked down. "She said she stopped arguing because every time she pushed back they accused her of not supporting family." That sounded familiar. Manipulative people often hide behind the word family. They use it as a shield, as an excuse, as a weapon. But family isn't permission. Family isn't ownership. Family isn't entitlement. I finished my coffee and sat back quietly. Suddenly a lot of things made sense. The confidence, the assumptions, the behavior at the cabin. It wasn't random. It came from years of private conversations, years of fantasy, years of convincing themselves that my hard work was somehow part of their future. The funny thing about fantasies is that reality eventually arrives, and reality rarely asks permission. A month later, reality arrived for Victor. The new owner of the cabin officially took possession. The locks had already been changed. The deed had already been transferred. Everything was complete. I heard later that Victor had driven out there without calling anyone first. Apparently, he wanted to show some relatives the property. When he arrived, he found strangers unloading furniture. According to Jacob, the conversation was short, very short. Victor tried explaining that he knew the place. The new owner politely informed him that knowing a place and owning a place were 2 very different things. For the first time in a very long time, reality had finally spoken louder than entitlement. After that, things slowly changed. Not overnight. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, but boundaries became clearer. Assumptions disappeared. Respect started returning. The constant talk about future inheritances suddenly stopped. Funny how that works. People become much less interested in your assets when they realize they have no control over them. Several months later, Jacob stopped by my house again. This time, there was no tension, no bad news, no uncomfortable conversations. We sat on the back porch watching the sunset. Eventually, he smiled. You know, Dad, I think this whole thing taught me something. I looked at him. What? He stared across the yard. Never confuse access with ownership. I smiled, because that was exactly the lesson, not just for him, for everyone. You can be welcomed into someone's life. You can be trusted. You can be loved. But none of those things give you the right to claim what isn't yours. As for me, I never regretted selling the cabin, not for a second. Because the real value was never in the property, it was in the lesson. And some lessons are worth far more than lakefront views. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that respect must be protected the same way you protect everything else you've spent your life building. Because once people start believing they deserve what you've earned, they stop appreciating what you've given, and that's when boundaries become necessary. Thank you for spending this time with me, and before you go, tell me what you think. Did I handle the situation the right way? What would you have done if you came home and found someone treating your property like their future inheritance? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share your thoughts below. And if you want more stories about family betrayal, hard-earned lessons, and quiet revenge, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourselves and protect what you've worked hard to build.